accordingly.
That's not what I said. You put words in my mouth. I said, should he be able to render an opinion, and should the Fed take that into consideration?
No.
I think he should be able to have an opinion.
I didn't say anything.
And they should take that into consideration. It shouldn't be the only thing.
I didn't
but
say
he should
anything.
have an opinion.
The president can have whatever opinions he wants.
Yeah.
What I'm asking is whether the Fed should be independent in their decision-making from those opinions.
And I said, does that mean they can take his opinion into consideration? And I think they should take the president's opinion into consideration. That's not the only thing. That's one of the things.
Here's what that framing really exposes. Before Scott Jennings speaks, the narrative is already set. One side is lying, the other is telling it like it is, and the audience is nudged to cheer instead of analyze. That's not insight, that's bias preloaded. Notice the tariffs aren't framed as a policy with real economic impact, just a loyalty test. Question them, and you're dishonest. Defend them, and you're courageous. And this is where democracy meets distortion. Tariffs affect prices, jobs, and inflation, not cable news ratings. Reducing that complexity to us versus them conditions voters, instead of informing them. There's also a psychological tell. Phrases like biggest draw or mocking entire panels often mask a reluctance to wrestle with inconvenient facts. Because facts still matter, even when inconvenient. Strong democracies don't need media cheerleaders. They need friction. Disagreement grounded in evidence, not contempt dressed as confidence. So before the argument even begins, ask yourself, are we being invited to think or just to pick a side? That distinction is everything. If you believe democracy works best when facts come before fandom, hit subscribe. We're here to slow the noise and tell the truth clearly. Together.
Well, the Fed is obviously independent. It's supposed to be independent, but independence in Trump's head does not exist. He does not understand why a federal government must be independent from himself. He believes that his power and the executive branch's power should dictate what happens with the Fed and with the Department of Justice and with our military, with all of the various things that should be independent. The reality is, as you talk about, Trump being spooked, it's a little late for Trump to be spooked at this point. We've been talking about tariffs. He has been talking about this for quite some time. The markets are in disarray. We're heading toward a recession. Everybody is saying that this is a terrible thing. And yet for just now, all of a sudden he woke up and he realized, this is a terrible thing for our economy and our country.
I just have to respond to your assertion that the federal government should operate independently of the elected president of the United States. You mentioned the Fed,
and the Department of Justice.
You said DOJ, which is obviously appointed and works for the president.
No, but it's independent. Your laws should not be enforced based on the president. They should be enforced based on the law.
You said the military. Obviously, he's the commander in chief of the military. I'm just trying to figure out what percentage or part of the government that you think should run away from the president.
There are institutions that are independent.
I'm going to step in here because I don't want us to change the subject, okay? We are talking about the independence of the Fed. Do you agree or disagree that the Fed should be independent?
I think the president should be able to render an opinion about
that is a
monetary
yes
policy.
or no.
Whether he should be able to fire him is an open question.
That is a yes or no question. Should the Fed be independent of the whims of any president of the United States?
I think the president ought to be able to have opinions.
Why can't you say yes or no?
Previous presidents.
I think it's an open question where they should be able to fire the head of the Fed. Some Republican senators don't agree.
So, Scott.
But I don't. Right. I just think the idea that the president should not have any opinion.
The criticism aimed at Abby Phillip isn't really about rudeness, tone, or even television etiquette. It's about discomfort. The kind that surfaces when a boundary is enforced publicly and without apology. A yes or no question only feels unfair when the answer threatens the story Scott Jennings is trying not to say plainly. Because clarity is dangerous to spin. Here's the contradiction doing the real work beneath the surface. Scott Jennings and his defenders insist the Federal Reserve doesn't have to follow Donald Trump, while simultaneously arguing it should be open to Trump's influence, discussions, and expectations. That's not balance. That's a rhetorical sleight of hand, preserving the language of independence while hollowing out its function. And this is where democracy meets misunderstanding. Checks and balances are not partisan inventions. They are constitutional guardrails, built deliberately because history keeps teaching the same lesson. When leaders confuse electoral victory with unlimited authority, institutions fail and citizens pay the price. The Fed exists precisely because monetary policy is too powerful, too consequential, and too easily abused to be placed inside the emotional orbit of any one president, Republican or Democrat. Markets don't react to confidence. They react to predictability, data, and trust that decisions won't shift with political moods. Now notice how the framing shifts the moment resistance appears. When courts intervene, it's called obstruction. When federal agencies assert independence, it's labeled sabotage. When journalists press for clarity, it's framed as hostility. But when Donald Trump pressures institutions to align with him, it's recast as leadership, as doing his job. That asymmetry matters, because accountability only works if it applies in all directions. Once scrutiny becomes disloyalty and limits become enemies, democracy starts getting reframed as a nuisance instead of a safeguard. That's not accountability. That's entitlement dressed up as efficiency. There's also a psychological layer worth naming here. When Scott Jennings portrays resistance as omnipresent, courts, agencies, the media, the bureaucracy, it signals something deeper than policy disagreement. It reflects an expectation of obedience rather than cooperation. Democracy doesn't reward certainty. It resists it. It slows decisions down on purpose. It forces leaders, including presidents, to justify actions with law, data, precedent, and evidence, not just electoral math. Because facts still matter, even when power grows impatient. The Federal Reserve isn't working against Donald Trump when it resists political pressure. It's working for the public, protecting savings, wages, mortgages, retirement accounts, and long-term economic stability from short-term political wins that feel good today and cost families more tomorrow. And let's be honest, we've seen this pattern before, across countries and across decades. When leaders argue that courts, agencies, economists, and journalists are all aligned against them, what they're really rejecting isn't opposition. They're rejecting the idea that their power has limits they don't personally control. That's the moment democracies face a choice. The takeaway is simple but foundational. Wanting power restrained isn't fear of leadership. It's confidence in democracy and trust that no one person should ever be bigger than the system itself.
And about monetary policy,
I'm going to give you a third try on this one. Should the Fed's decisions about how they operate, the interest rates, when they raise or lower them, should they be independent of the President of the United States?
Does independent mean they don't take his opinion into consideration?
Independent means no, they don't take his opinion into consideration.
I don't agree with that. I'm sorry. I think the president.
Okay.
I think the president should be able to render an opinion. I'm going to ask Charlotte, what do you know? This was taken in by the markets, that idea, right? This week, what was the reaction among people who are making money? They have businesses. They are operating in the financial world to this idea that people like Scott believe that the Fed should be listening to the president and act accordingly. That's not what I said. You put words in my mouth. I said, should he be able to render an opinion, and should the Fed take that into consideration?
No.
I think he should be able to have an opinion. I didn't say anything. And they should take that into consideration. It shouldn't be the only thing.
I didn't
but
say
he should
anything.
Have an opinion.
The president can have whatever opinions he wants. Yeah. What I'm asking is whether the Fed should be independent in their decision-making from those
And I said, does that mean they can take his opinion into consideration? And I think they should take the president's opinion into consideration. That is not the only thing. That's
let me see if Charlotte has some thoughts on this.
I think it's very clear from the market's response that not just the desired outcome, the fundamental law of nature needs to be that the Federal Reserve, the chair of the Federal Reserve, makes decisions on monetary policy that are based on economic data, not on the whims of a president. And that's very, very clear. And I think, the job of the Fed is complex, particularly in the environment in which Trump has placed Jerome Powell, where you have a threat of slowing growth and increasing inflation due to these tariffs, right? So you have a stagflationary environment that's very hard for the Fed to manage. It is true that some investors probably, if Jerome Powell were to lower interest rates.
If you like watching videos like this one, like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
I'm not going to predict how the market would respond. However, it's very, very clear that the market responds extremely negatively to even a hint that the president might intervene.
There's a direct
intervening and rendering an opinion are two different things.
There's a direct effect here with the American worker that has to do with China and with the stock market that people are seeing every day. Donald Trump ran on being tough on China, and workers and folks in America, they love that talk. They love being tough on China, but they also love getting really cheap stuff from Walmart, and they can't have both at the same time. And I think that's why you see him backing off of that. With the stock market, regular folks folks don't understand DAOs and bonds and all that, but they understand their 401k. And I think that's where the pressure's coming from, is people around there saying, you're hurting your own people. And so you see people backing down.
I think there is an argument.
Honestly, believe the president shouldn't be able to render opinions about monetary policy?
You keep repeating something that nobody ever said. No one ever said that Trump cannot have
We're having original thoughts here.
No, Scott. No one ever said that Trump can't have an opinion. The question is, should the Fed act based on that opinion? And I think it's just common sense, right? The Fed, it should be acting based on...
And here's where the argument fully gives itself away. The claim isn't just that Trump is being treated unfairly. It's that any limit on presidential control is proof of sabotage. That if institutions don't bend, they must be rooting against him. But that framing collapses under scrutiny. Here's the contradiction. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama operated within court rulings, statutory authority, and due process, even when deportation numbers were high. What's being challenged now isn't enforcement itself, but how enforcement is carried out. And this is where democracy meets distortion. Following the law isn't weakness. Media scrutiny isn't obstruction. And due process isn't a partisan invention. When enforcement actions trigger legal review or public attention, that's not the system working against a president. That is the system working, ensuring power is exercised lawfully, humanely, and transparently. There's also a psychological move happening here. By portraying accountability as persecution, responsibility gets flipped into victimhood. If every check is framed as an attack, then no outcome is ever owned, only blamed. Because facts still matter, even when they complicate the narrative. Democracy doesn't promise leaders unlimited speed. It promises legitimacy. It insists that power be justified, documented, and constrained, especially when people's rights are involved. And let's be real. Getting things done has never meant doing whatever you want. It's meant doing what the law allows, even when that's slower, messier, and less satisfying. The takeaway is this. A system that resists concentration of power isn't anti-progress. It's pro-democracy.